Welcome everyone to the April 27th, 2022 Cincinnati Public Schools Audit Committee meeting. Thank you very much for coming. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones so we don't have any interruptions. I'd like to start the meeting by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. So I'd like everybody to stand up, face the flag, and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Okay, the first item on our agenda is Dr. Turpeau is going to give us a talent department update. Lauren distributed, I guess, a summary of the audit committee talent. Well, it's called the audit committee talent update. Hope everyone had a chance to read it. But Dr. Turpeau, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm glad to be here today. I am going to give you an update on our staffing. We do have a slide deck available. All right, thank you. If you can go to the next slide. All right, so talent is really focused on and has aligned to the district's current strategic plan, and we're focused on optimizing our capabilities. Next slide. Our vision for our optimized capabilities, CPS staff are highly effective, deeply engaged in order to best serve our students. Next slide. Really, when we look at the talent wheel, several areas are called out on this chart. We kind of live by this chart in the different areas that we serve. So today we're going to talk a little bit about strategic staffing. Next slide, please. So when we look at the employee life cycle, we know that we touch employees at various stages of their careers. Mainly at the beginning of that stage, which is the recruitment and the hiring stage. So when we get this right, typically everything else falls in place. Next slide. So our challenge, as we all know, has been staffing. This is not a CPS problem. This is a national problem. So what I wanted to do is provide a national landscape of kind of what this looks like and what we're hearing from other districts. So basically this data, there was 100 urban districts that were surveyed, and 61 of those districts responded they are struggling and have shortages in their districts, 61% with instructional staff, 46 with non-instructional staff, 38 with substitute teachers, and then positions not detailed. So we know this is not just in Cincinnati, it's just not in Ohio, it's across the nation. But also with the next slide, I wanted to put that in perspective for Cincinnati Public Schools and what our current landscape looks like. So some of our critical positions that we need in order to support our students in our classrooms are, of course, our custodians, especially with the pandemic and the things that we're dealing with. When we look at our current vacancies for custodians, we have 46 vacancies. We currently have 80.67 positions filled. For our security staff, we're currently at 93.37. And for our teaching staff, we're at 96.32. So teaching staff, that equates to about 212 positions. Next slide, please. So our strategies, when we look at our hard to fill positions, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to call out, what do we consider hard to fill positions? You know, what are the positions that we're really focusing on for this year? 9-12 math and science have always been a challenge for CPS. It's just even harder this year than ever before. Our ESL population continues to grow, so we're kind of focused on that. Also wanted to offer different world language options, and we're looking at adding several buildings with ASL. Physical ed is a challenge. It doesn't sound like it would be, but many of our partner districts around the tri-state area are no longer offering that program in their education program. So we're having to get real creative and look at other universities outside of the tri-state area to kind of see where we could build that pipeline. Intervention specialists has always been a challenge, and we kind of look for new ways to recruit and also looking at alternative pathways for licensure. Foreign language just as a whole, Spanish. And then, of course, we just kind of looked at our custodian and security staff. Next slide, please. So what are our priorities as we look to recruit and hire? We're going to leverage data to inform our hiring. We're creating data routines around annual workforce planning, looking at our retirements, our separations, and staff retention surveys. We've had a lot of success this year with retention surveys, figuring out who's thinking about leaving the district and then finding out why they're leaving the district and trying to have those conversations to get them to stay. We're also assessing workforce diversity and plan for increasing diversity in our applicant pools. That goes back to strategic job fairs, making sure that we're in the right place at the right time, which goes into our student teaching, which is a big pipeline for us that we will continue to maximize. We do offer a lot of opportunities for our colleges to put students in classrooms in the district. So we're tapping into that, making sure that they are getting our early offers, making sure that we're touching them as soon as they reach the district, building those partnerships, and hopefully that commitment to come on board once they graduate. Like I said, early contracts. The sooner we can get to the market, the better off we're going to be in retaining the best talent and getting the best talent to join CPS. Focusing on our high need departments and buildings, making sure that they're aware that, CPS is a destination district. So we want to give them opportunities to learn about CPS early. That means we're out in the field and, it's a little bit different the way we operate because we really don't get to the market as far as advertising specific positions until after transfer rounds. So transfer rounds typically end about the end of March. And then we know after our teachers have all transferred and where they settled, then we know exactly what positions we have available for external candidates. So what we typically do is we look at those hard to fill positions and offer early contracts and blanket contracts because we know we're going to have opportunities in those areas. The other thing we're trying to do is incentives. We know that everyone in the tri-state is going after the same talent. So how do we attract them to CPS? We incentivize them to come to CPS. So right now we have a $2,000 incentive program that's in place that we are hoping to attract some of our talent away from other districts so that we can get them in CPS. The next thing is just expanding our recruiting efforts to increase and diversify our applicant pool. So we do have a dedicated team. That's the first time in several years that we've had people just focused on recruitment work. So we have a team that's really building those relationships with our pipelines that are going out touching student teachers, looking at alternative licensure pathways, building relationships with universities that we typically have not in the past. We're also promoting and participating in more local and out-of-state job fairs, including those that serve and pursue diverse populations. And this is not just for teachers, but we're looking for our paraprofessionals, we're looking for our NAP aides, we're looking for our security, in places we've never looked before. And we're also launching an internal referral program. So that's for staff that recommends people to these hard to fill positions. We want to encourage them to do so and at the same time be rewarded. And if you all haven't seen, we are hitting social media daily, making sure that we're getting the word out there. And it's been very helpful, including sources like LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, wherever we can market. Next slide, please. So the recruitment strategies, we kind of talked a little bit about those already, so I'm not going to hit all of these bullets, but, we are working with the University of Cincinnati on a couple of different grants for alternative licensure. So one of those programs is looking at people that have gotten bachelor's degrees in programs outside of education. And they currently have a grant that we're going to be participating in that will pay for a master's degree in education. And we're excited about it because that's a pipeline that we know we need to fill, and it's a pipeline that we didn't have access to before. So this is going to pay 2 years worth of education for a master's degree for people that may have a mathematics degree out of McMicken College. They may have a communication degree and looking to get in education. So this is a free way for them to get a master's degree and join CPS. Like I said, our job fairs, we're tapping into other schools that we normally haven't. Our Grow Your Own pipeline is a para to teacher pipeline. So looking at our internal talent that's already here, that's already committed to CPS, and giving them opportunities to grow into new positions. So we currently have about 39 paras or security that are participating in these programs right now. And eventually, that's our long game. It's not going to happen quickly. We have about 5 people coming out this year. Hopefully that grows next year, but we're meeting them kind of where they are as far as what they need in order to get that degree. We have some folks that just may need to take a test. We have other people that may need to take 4 or 5 classes. Whatever the case is, we're supporting them, giving them the opportunity, and hopefully getting them committed to the district at the end of that journey. Next slide, please. Civil service, like I said, it's always a challenge. This is really a group of people that we kind of see coming in and out because they have so many options out there. We're competing with, retail, we're competing with restaurant business, we're competing with just everyone. So we're trying to make it a lot more attractive for them to join CPS, giving them opportunities to grow, which is that para to teacher pipeline, and really supporting them. So we're trying to help them with test prep programs. For our civil service, you have to test for custodian, you have to test for senior support, for leads, a variety of different positions. We want them to be successful, so that's a new program that we're going to have, prepping them so they're successful. And our substitute pipelines for custodian and security. So this is a pipeline that allows them to come into the district, be able to support some of our positions before they actually get into those positions. So they're getting the experience. We're seeing if they like the work. If they like the work, then they can test to become a regular employee in that position. So that's been a great pipeline for us as well. Next slide, please. So when we look at our baseline data, kind of where our goals have been this past year, we were 94% of our schools were filled by August the 16th, which is a great number. 33% of our applicants identified as people of color, and 32% of those new hires identified as people of color. What we're hoping for this year is 100% of our buildings filled by the first day of school. A very aggressive goal, especially in this climate, but we are believing that through a really strategic plan of recruiting and hiring, we can get there. And for 2023-24, we're looking just to increase that diversity. Next slide. That's all I have for you all. What kind of questions do you have for me?
Any questions for Dr. Truffaut?
Yes.
Jim, I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. I did have a couple questions. Are you able to share any insights about why people are thinking of leaving the district? Why employees are thinking of leaving?
Yeah, I can give you just a little bit of that information just based on our exit interviews and things like that, is that, it's been a trying couple of years, it's tough. We know that we are a destination district, and when people want to be in education, they want to be in Cincinnati public schools. What we're seeing is people are leaving the field completely. So it's not that they're going to a neighboring district. That's not the case. We're seeing them leave the field altogether.
I had a couple. Your incentive program, that dollar amount, do you feel that that's competitive and meaningful?
I do, and the reason I'll say it is competitive is because a lot of districts aren't offering it right now, and our salary scales are very competitive, so that, in addition to the incentive, has been working pretty well for us right now.
One last question. The UC program with the grant, that they have an obligation to work?
No, there's no obligation, but it is about relationship, right? So if they are participating in the program, and we've kind of interviewed them first to be a part of CPS, and then go into the program, we want to make sure it's a right fit and they're committed to CPS.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I had similar questions, but so I would just ask that how often are we conducting the retention surveys?
So we send out the survey at the beginning of the year and towards about March, when we kind of start transfer rounds to kind of see who's planning on going, who's planning on staying. For those that really are in those hard to fill positions, they become priority. So we want to reach out to those folks and see why you're leaving. Sometimes it is just they want a change of environment. Sometimes they want to try other options. So we have a career specialist that can kind of talk to them about other options that might be available. Whether it's in that position or another position, we don't want to lose anybody. So if we can get them placed in a better situation, we want to do so.
And these are conducted for all active
Correct.
colleagues. And are you conducting exit interviews as well?
Yes, exit and stay.
And are you having any difficulties with terms not being in the system timely, so that you're not getting to those people before they've exited?
Yeah, so that's always a challenge, especially with our civil service population, because sometimes they're gone before they even tell us they're leaving. So they don't return at all. So those we kind of miss out, But for the most part, people that are planning ahead, many of our teachers kind of will tell us, hey, I'm not coming back at the end of the school year. Those are the ones that we can kind of be, proactive and can address those issues ahead of time. Yeah.
Last question. Do you know your retention rate?
We are 12%. We're losing about 12%.
And what's your goal?
We want to get it below 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions for Dr. Trippo?
Well, thank you all.
Thank you very much for coming.
I appreciate it. I am going to ask Keith Grace, who is our benefit manager, to come up and talk a little bit about our benefit audit.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I wanted to just give you guys an update on the benefit audit that took place a couple of years ago. The last update was provided back in February, and at that time we had stated we were going to work with the internal audit team and start conducting self-audits. And I wanted to update everyone that has begun, and we have started that self-audit process. We have completed three self-audits to date, and with those 3, we did find that one had no findings, and that would be covering the first objective, or the first audit objective. Then there were 2 others that were completed. One did have one finding where an invoice was not accurate, and so that was corrected and then sent back out. And then we completed a 3rd audit on actually using the invoice system. At this time, we are looking at conducting 2 self-audits every month, and with that, we should be complete with the self-auditing process by the end of July. And then at that time, we're going to continue to work with the internal audit team to find out how we can further gain efficiencies in the benefits department.
So Keith, are you auditing your own employees that report to you, or are you an independent person?
So we are auditing what's in the system itself. So it's what the employees in the benefit section put into the system, and then that is what's being checked to check for accuracy.
But you're the benefits manager, so these are your employees that are entering the data?
Yes, sir.
Correct. Okay.
And if I might add as well, so the second page of the audit status report provides an update as to the work that internal audit has done. So Keith did a great job updating from the benefits perspective. And then if you're curious to see the internal audit perspective, they do coincide. Essentially, we've discussed along with Dr. Tarpeau and Susan Bunty, the idea that the benefits group, as Keith described, will put the corrections in place, implement the corrections. Then we've partnered together to kind of coach Keith's team on how to self-audit. So we've allowed them to view all of our past work papers. They're essentially taking that approach and checking themselves. And so kind of a joint thought process, please correct me if I'm wrong, but our joint thought process is that if their self-audits come through without exception, they should notify us, and it's perhaps time for a more formal independent follow-up audit from internal audit. And then conversely, if there are issues that are identified, that means this testing process is working, time to go back and change some of the remediations and then retest once those have functioned. So that's kind of how we're thinking ahead as we try to measure and move the work along. And then with that being said, what will transpire over the coming months is we'll work together to say what areas may be ready to be included for a full follow-up, and we'll include that in our fiscal 23 internal audit plan.
Great answer, Lauren. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions for Keith?
I do. So when you're doing your audit, are you running reports, or are you just manually going through paperwork and comparing?
Both. So some audits rely on the reports that are generated out of the system. Others, we have to actually go and check documents. And those documents are oftentimes uploaded into the system, but we do have to check and make sure that they do exist and that they do coincide with what's needed for that particular item.
So are you comparing what's in your benefit enrollment system to what's being deducted from the payroll system?
Yes, it's all, yeah.
Comparison.
So what we have are reports that, the macro reports where it marries up the information, and those reports are reviewed as part of this process.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Keith? Thank you very much for your presentation. Excellent. Lauren, you're going to audit reports and updates, I guess, starting with the asset inventory internal audit report. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to see you. If I may ask, we pull the presentation up that is titled Audit Reports and Updates. Wonderful, thank you. So in your packets, you have a copy of this presentation as well as all of the items that are listed here in our overview of topics. So our approach this time is a little different, as I mentioned in our email. In the past, we used to have the time when we produced one audit to kind of walk you through the thought process, give the full background. But now that we have a great team and we are producing reports more rapidly, we're working under the assumption that everyone's had the time to read the report. And we're just going to hit the high notes, and then we can stop for questions and further discussion. So my hope is that we can have a more collaborative conversation, utilize this great team for your thoughts and perspectives, and ultimately help further, move along our recommendations. So with that being said, as I mentioned, you have a copy of the report and then also the slides. So let's move on to the first slide around our asset inventory audit. So over the past 5 years, the management team around fixed assets has made tremendous strides. Dating back at about that time, we implemented a position, I should say the Treasurer's Office implemented a position of the fixed assets supervisor. And over that time, tremendous work has been done of each aspect of the asset life cycle in regards to additions, disposals, transfers, as well as inventory cycle counts. So our purpose when we came into this area is to say, are those things working? But what we found is yes. But now how do we take that to, the end zone here? I keep using the analogy rather that we're on the 10-yard line here. We're in the red zone, we're ready to score. And I think that's where internal audit can provide a bit of assistance when we think through assets. So I'll go through 2 of the tests that were performed. If we think through typical asset inventory, folks who are familiar, it's a book to floor test and a floor to book test. And so I'll cover what we see and what we observed and then kind of tie this back to the idea of data reconciliation. So what you see before you are the results of the tests that were performed. So Isaac Karn went out to 4 of our schools, selected 25 assets at each location from the Business Plus data. So that's what we call our book in this regard. So he went out with his list of assets and worked to identify them in the field. So as you see from the results, 76 of the assets were in fact identified either by us or through follow-up with management. However, the other that stand out to you, as they did to me, were the 23 that were not identified. So perhaps the initial thought is, where are those assets? And luckily through follow-up, we were able to kind of minimize our concerns about the whereabouts and more so focus on the data itself. So of the 23 assets, 20 of those assets were technology assets. The other 3 related to facilities. And what we found through follow-up, we asked the facilities team, the device management team to deep dive into this information. And they were able to utilize some additional tracking systems they have in place around technology to discover that these items had in fact been disposed of many years prior. And it was pretty evident once they glanced, a laptop from 10 years ago, there's no way that's still being utilized. And in their system, they saw in fact it had been disposed. So I definitely think it minimizes our concern that these items have walked off. I really think this is more about using the data we have and reconciling it so our asset data in the system reflects those things. So moving on to the other side of the test here, this is our floor to book test. So in the same sense, at the 4 locations, Isaac was able to select 5 items from the floor and then look for them in the database, the data from Business Plus rather. And so 12 of those assets were located on the floor, were also in the Business Plus system. However, 8 of those assets that had a tag at the school location were not in our fixed asset system. So what we learned through conversation was that 5 of the 8 were actually scanned in the scanned inventory data. So for context, that's our other data set, all of those scans that are performed on an annual basis. And so those scan data essentially ran into some technical issues with the upload. So that data did not make it into Business Plus. So what we recommend is a reconciliation of data utilizing the scan data and making sure everything that's been scanned is in Business Plus. And then conversely, things that are in Business Plus that have never been scanned, utilizing those reconciling items and reviewing them. That brings me to the next slide here around the recommendations. So as I mentioned, the reconciliation of the asset data is one that can certainly be led by our fixed assets supervisor with the support of internal audit. However, the items that come from this, that list of reconciling items, is really a question of who all within this, is really a matter of district-wide support. So those assets really need to be divided out. The technology assets can be handed over to our technology team, further researched, and ultimately they can be updated, properly tagged, scanned, and they should remain in our system, or conversely find that they have been removed and possibly should be disposed of and ultimately removed from the system. So I say all that to say that we are really on the precipice of having a very clean set of information. It's just now taking all of these great components that have been done so far and bringing them all together. And so we're confident through a reconciliation, once this data really is fully reconciled, it'll be easier to identify things in the future. So if in the future we go out to a school and don't find a scan that was there last year, we say what's happened in the time since, and we really can follow up and review it. So I really think I feel very confident in this area, but I do think once we get the data piece really reconciled, it'll give us a really nice foundation as we move forward.
I have a question for you, Lauren.
Yeah.
I'll look through here. I didn't see a single dollar sign in this inventory audit report. What I'm used to seeing is a listing of fixed assets and the cost. Then that comes to a total cost of fixed assets.
Yeah.
It ties into a financial statement.
Correct.
Do we, as a district, not care about the cost of these things, or are dollars out the door, dollars out the door? I mean, that's a piece that I'm used to seeing. That can you address that?
Yeah,
There's no
absolutely.
control totals.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially the way that the audits are positioned, I would say, is when we think through internal audit, we think, how do we supplement the work that's being performed by our external auditors rather than reperforming the work? So essentially what's done during our financial reporting and the work that's done by Plattenberg and the gap statement production, as well as our external audit, is they tie all of those numbers together and they perform that piece of the audit. However, we look at this from more of an asset protection as well as data tracking perspective. So what we did in terms of the dollar amount with this work is every asset in the Business Plus system is coded. So those codes tell us, based on the combination of codes, what type of asset it is. So in the About section of the report, you'll see that there are tracked assets, those that fall below, I believe, a $5,000 or a $25,000 threshold for non-federal funds, and then those that are greater than $5,000 for federal funds are in fact reported. So we utilize those tracked versus reported thresholds when we think through the materiality of this work. But I will say, in terms of the dollar value, there are dollars associated with each of these items in this data set, which only further emphasizes the need to ensure that it's properly reconciled so we're not over or under reporting.
Doesn't Plattenberg get a listing of fixed assets then that they review? Shouldn't that be what we were testing, the listing of fixed assets that ties to the financial statement?
Correct. Yep. So that is very similar to what we did. So essentially the data that is utilized for the fixed asset reporting in the financial statements is an extract from the Business Plus data. So the data that would have been evaluated at the last audit would have been for fiscal 21. So our audit focused on fiscal 22 to date. So it is in fact the same data source, but we would not tie it back since the data has changed since that cutoff period. Does that help address it all?
I mean, somewhat. And then you had a bunch of items that were on the floor that weren't in the books. So I guess that means they were expensed as repairs or supplies or something like that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, those were disposed of. So through further research, or pardon me, those were scanned and they fell through with the upload, pardon me.
So they weren't in the listing of fixed assets that we gave to Plattenberg that ties to our finance.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Any other questions for Lauren? Yes, Mike.
I would just ask, since we have Ms. Davis here, if we can put that 7455 on the next policy agenda, and then if you can be there, Ms. Roberts,
Absolutely.
that'd be great. So we'll invite you, and we'll have you go early so you don't have to sit there the whole time.
Absolutely. That's
Thank you.
perfect. Thank you. Yep. So that's just a brief update. Yes, Jen, please.
So typically the financial policies go through finance before they go to the policy committee. So we're putting it on the next agenda for finance.
It's unfortunate that policy occurs literally right before finance, so it'll have to wait 2 months.
We
But
can go
yes.
either. We can do it either way, but that's
No, that's
typically
fine.
how we've done it in the past. If you don't mind, can we introduce Brian Kennedy, please?
That is my next note. Thank you
Yes.
so much. So I wanted to give my appreciation to both Isaac Karn, our internal audit staff who led the work from an audit side, as well as Brian Kennedy, who is the elusive fixed asset specialist I was mentioning, who's really done a phenomenal job in this regard. So I do welcome Brian if he's interested, or if he just wants to give everyone a wave. He really stepped up through this audit. Wonderful. So I will move on to our payroll audit if there aren't any other questions. Wonderful. So let me change gears here a little bit. So you do have a copy of the full payroll audit in your folders. So this was the project that was recommended to us at the conclusion or the beginning of fiscal 23. This is kind of an add-on, I think, from Ms. Mitchell Lawrence, which we appreciate. And so we're excited to share some results from the follow-up audit that was completed. So for perspective, it was uploaded into the Google Drive. We completed a full payroll audit back in fiscal 2017. And so to frame this conversation, our follow-up audits are typically limited in scope in that they target the same tests that were performed the first time, as well as those recommendations to say, how have we progressed since the initial audit? And so what we found, we are pleased to report, is that payroll, in fact, operates effectively based on what is entered into the system. And so it is critical, though, for us to further evaluate those inputs for reasonableness and compliance with our collective bargaining agreements, as well as the completeness and accuracy of the data. So to what this means for us is that based on the CBA terms that are entered into the system, as well as the factors that are input by our employees, our timekeepers, so on and so forth, the system and the payroll part of this process does its job. So the predominant focus of this audit will be on the CBAs and overtime. And for the interest of time today, that's where we'll spend most of our focus. So one of the recommendations from the fiscal 2017 audit was around the collective bargaining agreement. So you may have noticed in the Google Drive, and Tim even mentioned to me, wow, that's a lot of paper. Once he printed it out, there are a lot of pages to our CBAs. In fact, we have 6 collective bargaining agreements, each with their own unique set of terms, pay factors, and considerations. So the original recommendation was that the CBAs be more streamlined in terms, in both the contract terms as well as the documentation. What we had found, as I mentioned, differing terms are hard to program into a system, as well as documentation that is constantly evolving. After the initial CBA is approved, we have memorandums of understanding, as we refer to MOUs, that then become supporting documentation. So it's really critical that those two components come together to not only streamline, but also centrally retain documentation so it can be utilized by both payroll as well as our talent development department, who enters more the HR side of things. So we are pleased to report that there has been progress made in terms of streamlining. One of the pay factors that we focus in our audit is called longevity. It's essentially a seniority pay factor that adds on after a certain number of years. But for our CFOP contract, management in the district was successful in consolidating those terms into the salary schedule. So instead of having 2 things to track, we now have one that is equal in pay but more simplistic. So we recommend that management try to embed other terms like longevity in our other contracts as well, so we start to cut down on some of this complexity. The second recommendation from 2017 revolved around a single owner responsible for overseeing the contract documentation. As I already mentioned, all of these documents for all of these unions can become a little dispersed, as we observed back in 2017. So we're pleased to report the addition of our employee and labor relations manager, who was added this past summer, who now will be in charge and a single point person for this type of work. So I think it's a really great opportunity for us to have a single point to really organize things in both the documentation aspect, but also the negotiation side as well. So the new recommendation for this year, this is the meat of the matter when we talk about CBAs as far as I'm concerned. So really the key here is that there is a lag time between the period start date of the contract and the date that the contract is fully executed and available. So as we observe this year, the most recent contracts that had a start date of July 1st of 2021 were not actually available until the start of our audit in March 2022. So, however, I should say the caveat to that is that the board comes to an agreement on the key factors that are changing, and then basically legal counsel and the district and union representation work to embed those into the contract. But when we view this from a very practical sense from payroll and talent development, I believe it is critical for the fully executed, fully complete documentation to be available at the start of the contract period. What we've seen through our observations is that these pay factors can have a lot of nuances. You know, is it by the hour? Is it by the week? How does our overtime function? And so I believe it is a significant risk, the time that we have between the start of the contract period and actually having those full contracts in hand. So we did put our heads together between Treasury, Talent Development, as well as Legal Counsel and our Employee Relations Group, and said, how do we combat this? Because it really is a risk to the district as well as our employees. So I really believe, as an objective person, that both the district and the unions should have a vested interest in these two things improving and coming together. And so the recommendation that we thought through is possibly adding language that the once that list of changes, the summary is agreed upon, that a fully executed and completed contract must be in hand, fully signed within 30, 60, or 90 days thereafter. So I think everyone would have an interest in seeing that move along. It might speed up some negotiations that could tend to lag because historically we go back and we retro to the July 1st period for things that take a long time to settle out. And so when we think through the risk, I really think that is a significant area because it puts our payroll and our talent development department in a tricky spot of kind of guessing or making assumptions, I should say, because they do have a list. I don't want to say that they don't, but there are some conclusions I think they have to make at times, and a full contract would be critical to make those more clear. Any questions on the CBAs before I move along? Because I know that is kind of a tricky one. Okay, wonderful. So I would say this becomes the other half of the focus of today's conversation, and that's overtime. So I should say Emma Williams, our internal audit supervisor, did a phenomenal job in this area. She brings to us a great skill set in data analytics. And so the first thing Emma did is she adjusted our testing style. Rather than a random selection of 25 or 100 like I did last time, she analyzed the full population of overtime data for fiscal 22 to date and identified some really notable trends. So one thing that she found is there is a number of individuals, employees with a significant amount of overtime. And so what she did is she sorted all of those individuals and selected the top 25. So from the top 25, that became our basis of our sample and our testing. So she looked into and further analyzed the top 25 overtime earners and identified some trends. And so what we do conclude is that there is an excessive amount of overtime based upon the evaluation of the top 25 earners.
Yeah, but Lauren, the big overtime people are the custodians, and we can't fill those positions.
Yes.
So it makes perfect sense that we have to pay somebody to clean these buildings.
Yeah, exactly. And so I would say this is a twofold area. So that was the first question when I shared this with Jen, is she said, is this a COVID trend? Is this, what is the driver between this? And so if you look at pages 9 and 10 of the report, you'll see some graphs that I didn't take the time to put up on here to keep things simple. But we do have a year-over-year analysis of the total hours of overtime. And if you glance through, you can see that this year to date is significantly higher than in the past. So there could be some correlation between, perfect timing, having a staffing update, the things we just heard, the challenges in filling positions. However, I do believe, based on the evaluation of the top 25, that there are trends in possibly above average use of overtime. And so that's where our recommendations come into play as it relates to overtime. So we believe there needs to be a significant enhancement of internal control to prevent the excessive use of overtime. And so 2 of those possible control suggestions include a pre-approval of overtime. And fortunately, some of the CBAs actually say that that should be the process. We just historically have not done that. So that allows us to get pre-approval and put a cap on the overtime that we're paying, as well as make sure it has a proper purpose before it occurs. Conversely, on the back end, so this is more of a review control, all of the overtime right now is being approved through the typical time card approval by the supervisor. However, we considered a possible threshold in the system that once a certain amount of overtime is entered on a time card, it now goes to a second level of approval, whether it be a manager, director, or performance leadership team person to really review. And that, I think, just folks knowing that someone else is looking to sometimes is a great preventative control. And so finally, I will say there are some additional implications that are being brought about by Ohio Senate Bill 47. So this is actually great timing from our perspective as an organization. This Ohio bill actually goes into effect July 6th of this upcoming year of 22. And so we would be right in line for us to further control, further evaluate, and really align ourselves with the movement of the state, and that overtime has to meet certain criteria, and it seems to be a statewide initiative. So I think it really is wonderful timing for us to go through these considerations. So I will say finally that in terms of what do we do about the overtime that's occurred to date, and then where are we headed next, I've met with both Treasurer Wagner and incoming Superintendent Wright, and we had a very honest conversation about getting down into the data, as well as what will we do to implement these controls as soon as possible. And I know Jen already said that incoming Superintendent Wright has already mentioned this to the performance leadership team as a key initiative and key focus. So I'm confident between the three parties, between internal audit and then both our financial leadership as well as district leadership, this is something we can get in control.
Lauren, do the supervisors or managers that approve this overtime, are they being held to a budget where they only let us spend a certain amount of money? Do they care, basically? It's not really their money.
Certainly. And I think, there are budgets that are set up for these things, and there are controls in place to flag if we exceed budget. But I think these other controls would prove to be needed based on what we've seen thus far. So folks may care. It's hard for me to speak to that. But I think we've seen through the data that additional controls would help ensure everyone is focused on this.
There's no financial incentives for achieving budget or no penalty for spending more than budget or anything like that. I mean,
there's a level of accountability and review when people go over budget, but certainly there's no incentive to meet your budget. I think, we tend to give kudos for folks who can be more effective and efficient with their spend.
Yeah. So I did note that I saw that it was noted that it was determined that the payroll system was calculating overtime correctly. But my question is, did we do any samples that would look at anyone who's having an FLSA rate of overtime, or anyone who would have, I know you mentioned with the union, a lot of those are retroactively, and making sure that when we're having to go back and retroactively calculate based on 6 months ago, is the overtime calculating correctly in those type of scenarios as well? Were we looking at that, not just who's making the most, but those variables that occur that the system does a different calculation for FLSA?
Absolutely. No, that's a great question. And so you're leading me to the next conversation point perfectly. So I could have pretended we were a plant. That was great. So you're spot on. So what we did realistically is that we tested this time and said, are things at a base level functioning? And they are. Like you said, the system works the way it's set up to work based on the factors from the CBAs, based on what people enter. But that's where we really need to go a level beyond. And I think you were spot on, Ms. Mitchell, in that we needed to make this a focus and a priority. And I would only like to emphasize that in that I truly believe this should be in our plan this upcoming fiscal year and beyond. And so I'll say what we found in our final testing, and I'm going to come back to that point. And so the final test that we did was a general payroll test, very simple again. However, in our selections, we included some of our high overtime earners. I included 2 or 3 new hires, some terminations, as well as change in union and a few other unique factors to say for those folks that had something notable happen this year, is their pay still correct? And so we saw no exception. All of the gross pay is correct. But I truly believe that's not where the complexities lie. I should say there are more complexities beyond that, because that is a complex process in itself. But I do believe our payroll system functions and our payroll team executes what the base level is with fidelity. So really my recommendation in this regard is that we start to take a deeper dive in all of the sub-processes. And it's almost a bit laughable when we start to list as a team. I've pulled folks together and said, let's start listing what are the sub-processes that impact payroll, and they are numerous. So I threw a handful up there. I know it looks like little words, but that's really the point. There are so many sub-processes between pay assignments, Schedule E, which is our coaches, extracurricular. Each one of these things is a process in an audit, so to speak, in and of itself. And so I think the work that needs to be done moving forward is we partner with our management team and say, what are your areas where you could use some insight and where are the areas of risk? And we put our heads together with both our treasurer's office leadership as well as talent development to prioritize those areas because they're complex. And I think that's where the real rubber meets the road. So I think you're absolutely spot on. So it's those retros, it's all of those unique circumstances to make sure that those are also functioning. So that's where we're headed. And with your support, I do plan to include that in the upcoming internal audit plan. Fantastic.
Okay, let's move on to the audit status report. Lauren?
Tim, I do have one more question. With the overtime, with more approvals needed and more control on overtime, are you thinking about perhaps an unintended consequence where a school doesn't get cleaned because I just want to make sure that is noted and thought about.
Absolutely. That's always the balance sometimes as we think through the controls and processes to match that with the reality of the situation. And I think that's something for us to be really, really cognizant of. And hopefully we can perhaps leverage the folks that are working a lot of overtime and partnering with Dr. Tarpeau and say, are there vacancies that we should be filling to then better allocate that work? So you're spot on though. I certainly don't think it should come at the cost of serving our schools and students.
Okay, audit status report.
Great.
Lauren, you're still on. You're still on.
No worries, it's good. So in your document packet, you also have an audit status report. I would like to report and celebrate that we completed all of our fiscal 2022 internal audit plan engagements this year. It's been a heck of a push. Unfortunately, you may have remembered we had a co-sourcing agreement this year that fell through due to staffing shortages. So I have to give our team as well as our new hire, Emma, who hit the ground running, major kudos for picking up about 1,000-hour deficit and still pulling together all 4 reports. So my team did a phenomenal job and I'm really proud of the work we produced this year. So with that being said, I won't read through the report. I already mentioned the one note about the benefits update in there. There are a few other updates. If you have questions, feel free, grab me afterwards, send me a message. And moving right along to a couple or a housekeeping item of sorts would be my annual evaluation. So I think we all know the process at this point, but if you could please review my self-evaluation that's contained in your packets and provide any feedback you may have or would like to share with me to Tim Heldman by May 4th, that would be greatly appreciated. And then Tim will compile the information and submit that to our talent development team as well as myself by the following Wednesday, May 11th.
Please do so.
Yes, I'm very, very open to feedback. I appreciate your time with that. And then we do, remind me, we have until 5:35 on the agenda. Wonderful. So
6 minutes.
Okay, 5:30, got it. So as we think through for this upcoming year's plan, I remember vividly standing here at this time last year talking about the fiscal 22 plan and how do we properly engage our audit committee in this process. And so I know the feedback I received last April was to really rely on the feedback from our treasurer and superintendent as they are the key leaders of the district. And I do believe that will continue to be true with our incoming superintendent. I assume from a quick conversation with her, I gathered she's excited to leverage audit. She really can use us as a tool, as our treasurer successfully has over the years, to get insight into risk areas, since they know the risks sometimes better than anyone as they are the leader of those areas. However, I do want to caveat that and say that I do report to the Board of Education as well as the Audit Committee, and the feedback from this group is truly paramount. So I designed a timeline in front of you there that incorporates all of these factors. You can see we start with interviewing and surveying all of the district leadership. Last year, I think we met with almost 50 leaders within various departments and schools to get their feedback. We would then plan to take that to our treasurer and superintendent, pull all of those ideas together, and then compile some of, I think the feedback from last time was the survey was nice, but we don't want an open-ended survey. We want some options. And so what we'll do is we'll put together some options of advisory, assurance, and follow-up projects and send that out to the committee for feedback. And if there's anything you don't like about the survey, please let me know. I can change it. I'm going to do my best, but please let me know. And we ask that you complete that by June 12th as we are meeting with our audit committee chairs on the 13th. So we'll take all of that feedback, share that with them, and start to put our heads together. And we do include Finance Chair Bolton in those conversations as well. So if the board has some feedback and thoughts, if she could bring that to that conversation, and we can continue to whittle that plan down ultimately to present it to the audit committee on June 29th. So I do want to get your feedback. I want to make sure that this is an agreed upon approach to make sure that we have the proper support, feedback, and input throughout this process.
I have a question. Is there any way you can put together like a survey of these things and email it to us that we could go out and electronically put our feedback as well as like your evaluation instead of emailing it to Tim? Is there a way that you can create that type of
Yeah. So the risk survey and the planning survey will be electronic.
Okay.
And in terms of the evaluation, just an email to Tim with your thoughts and feedback, I think is what we're looking for that regard.
Okay.
And then he compiles that and does the risk ratings here. I'm thinking risk assessment and does the evaluation ratings.
Okay.
But I'm sure he's open to conversation, as am I, about it as well. But yes, the survey will be electronic. It should likely be a Google survey. So if you have trouble with Google, let me know. We can put it in a different format too. My pleasure.
Thanks, Lauren. Anybody have any questions for Lauren before we move on?
Wonderful.
Okay, so Eve, you came up. Were you going to start with the transportation update, or is Connie here? Okay, Connie, you have the floor.
Ms. Solano presented at Monday night's meeting an extensive summary of the work that's been done over the year since the crisis in August. And I'm sure that we will be able to share some aspects of the report that she shared with us. I don't know if we have the whole think we got it? Do we have part of it? We were thrilled with the work that's been done, the advice you all have given through the Finance Committee to the administration. And remember, there's several trails, but there's these two giant halves, which are the yellow bus for our younger kids, and then the metro experience. What you're going to be seeing for the most part is the success that we're having now in planning the yellow bus for PK, used to be 6, but perhaps it is now PK 8. And they need a decision from the board as to which option that we think is best based upon their advice and their research. We are very, very happy right now as a board with at least where we are with the yellow bus. And Connie can share some of that with you. I know she knows we don't have that much time, but at least can do the highlights. The other piece of that is that we do have, as we mentioned to you before, this year, in the next 2-3 months, we have to negotiate a new, or we, I guess, are in a position to renegotiate another contract with Metro. And I know that's why our general counsel's here too, to talk about that if need be. But the 5-year contract, we're in the last year of it during this crisis year, is up, and we will need to be doing that again. Hopefully not under the same circumstances that we are living now, or maybe even under the circumstances we lived a few years ago, but with some sort of new vision as to what would be best and possible for both entities. So I'll let Connie kind of get started, and we will be able to share this with you, I believe, electronically later when it is finalized as well.
About 10 minutes, Connie. Will that work?
Okay, I'll run right through it. So just to recap the services that we offer versus what the state requires. The state requires K through 8 who live more than 2 miles are eligible for transportation. CPS currently offers K through 6 who live at least 1 mile away, and 7 through 12 who live at least 1.2 miles. So there were several things that we had to consider. For one, the dynamics that are happening today. One is the supplier impact on student transportation. The extra routes were stopped this summer, and what that did was the 7 through 12 children had to get on the regular buses, and in that also had to take transfers to get from one bus to another. Due to the pandemic, there were bus driver shortages all over the country. And I'm sure you've noticed it when you've gone to get gas, fuel costs have skyrocketed. And as Board Member Bolton mentioned, this is our last year of the current contracts we've had with our yellow bus vendors. We put out an RFP, and all of their prices have gone up by, on average, 10%. And then when you look for each consecutive years over the next 5 years, they're going to continue to go up. So with all that in mind, we had several things we had to do. One was select vendors that could collectively meet the district's transportation needs. We also talked about the possibility of getting a CPS fleet so that we can do things like field trips, healthcare visits. And then we wanted to do an optimization study so that we can explore how we can maximize bus seat usage and at the same time control the number of yellow buses we need. Because one of the things we wanted to do was see if we can get 7th and 8th graders on a yellow bus, because we did have a lot of parent concerns that those kids were taking the regular metro and then having to transfer. So when we looked at the optimization study report, the things that we wanted to look at, next slide, please. As I mentioned, 7th and 8th graders on the bus. We also wanted to take consideration of the amount of time they were on the bus to get to school and home. And so we wanted to limit it to 55 minutes if at all possible. And then what would the impact of cost be if we gave everybody eligibility at 1.0 mile and not split it out between 1.0 and 1.25 miles? And then we did have some high schools starting at 9:15, and which there were a lot of community concerns, only because they get out later. And so we wanted to see, okay, what would happen if we moved them earlier? What would be the impact to the overall transportation logistics? We can go to the next one. That just shows the optimization. So there were actually A through G options. And the status quo, and I know you can't see it, but the first column would be the status quo, and shows you the average runs per bus. I apologize for that, but the number of buses that we're currently using is 319. That's the status quo. And their optimization study, every single option was able to get under that. And so the one that I really focused on was option G. As I mentioned, you can't see it on that, so we'll make sure you get a copy that it's eligible, is legible. We are able to reduce the number of buses we need by 18, and if you can imagine, each bus is roughly, I want to say $100,000 it's costing us to provide service with. So we can go from 319 buses to 301 buses. That means we don't need to add extra buses. We don't need to use extra buses. And that includes adding 7th and 8th graders on the bus. It includes pushing earlier the start times for those high schools that start at 9:15. It includes everybody eligible for transportation at 1.0 miles. So we were able to meet those desires that the board had and do it with less bus. And that is the beauty of algorithms. So overall, on average, our younger babies would only have like a riding time of like 23 minutes. And of course, the older kids, their riding time is a little bit more because we have high schools of choice, and these kids don't necessarily don't necessarily go to schools in their neighborhood. And then when you look at costs, next slide, please. The status quo with those 319 buses, it's about $32 million for this year. Now, mind you, this doesn't include like costs for staff, salary and benefits, doesn't include the cost we pay on fuel. It's just literally looking how much does it cost to run these buses. And option G, it's about $2 million less. And primarily that's because we're going from 319 buses to 301 buses. And then when you look at the metro costs, of course, now that we don't have 7th and 8th graders getting metro passes, it is cheaper. But then again, those kids are now in 7th and 8th grade buses, and that's even cheaper because we're not using as many buses. We're expecting an increase in cost to transport our neediest of kids. Those are our foster care children, our homeless children. And then we have some students with disabilities that have to take a special van. But even with those costs, if we go to the summary of costs, 2 more slides. Yes. You can see I have a comparison of this year's cost to what we're projecting if we only use the 301 yellow buses. So our cost for Metro, and that would be K8 on the yellow bus, plus Metro would be 912, all at 1.0 miles for eligibility, plus the increased cost we expect for homeless and foster care, plus the cost we expect for students with disabilities to get that van transportation. And if we decide to do the CPS fleet, we are at a wash with what we're paying this year for our yellow bus services. So one caveat is these simulations were run based on our current transportation usage. Okay, so we would have to do a rerun of the analysis in July once we get all of our new kindergartners and we have in our system any transfer outs, enrollment in. But so if you figure at most maybe plus or minus 500,000, plus or minus 5 vehicles, it would still be less if we took out it would still be less, not considering the bus fleet to do that. But as the way it stands now, with all these options that were asked by the board, we believe we're able to do it at a neutral cost. So the only other thing that we have to do now is wait on the board to make a decision, hopefully sooner, so that I can put these vendors at rest because they're all like really anxious about getting their contracts and knowing how many routes they're going to get so they can get prepared for the next school year. And then once we know what option the board wants, then we know how many buses we need, we know what type of buses we need, and we know how to distribute those buses based on the cost for those buses that the vendors have told us. Okay, and of course, we want to be prudent with our funds. So if 2 vendors have the same type of buses, and we're going to obviously go with the one that's more cost effective for us. And as I mentioned before, we're going to rerun the scenario again in July to get the most up-to-date data. And then we do plan on having some key performance indicators that we're going to be measuring to make sure that our processes are working and that we're providing our customers with the best service. And that is getting to school on time, picking them up on time, answering parent concerns, getting kids on a bus, as quickly as possible from the time that they enroll. Hope that wasn't more than 10 minutes.
So we're getting along with Metro okay now? I mean, we're working with, no?
This is the platform from which whatever we propose to Metro in our negotiation launch from this platform, because we've now hopefully taken care of our younger kids, our 5 or 6 yellow bus vendors, our special vendors for our very special kids. That is so important to have gotten at some place of some degree of launch, if you will. And then with help of council and the whole board and our transportation folks and our treasurer, we'll figure out the proposal to Metro. And from that, we will all find a good solution for our teenagers. Yes.
9 to 12.
9-12, not 7-12.
So my question would be, we have schools like Withrow, Walnut, that have 7 through 12. Are those considered high school, and will they get Metro access? My next question, follow up to that, is I know we provide additional like vouchers or whatever, tokens for kids who participate in our athletic programs for after school. So if those 7th and 8th graders are having to ride the yellow bus, are we making sure that we're accounting for that additional funding for those tokens that we give those students who participate in extracurricular activities.
Yes, so the 7th through 12th grade schools, the 7th and 8th graders will get on the yellow bus. The 9th to 12 will be Metro. If there's kids who have after-school programs, they will get whatever they need for those programs. So, but it's going to be based on the semester. So if they're only, playing soccer until November, that's how long their card's going to be active. So that's something that we're going to be working out with Metro to do that. And also, if they have an older sibling, you have a 7th grader, he has a 9th grade sister, if he wants to ride the bus with the sister on the Metro, we'll allow it. The parents just have to let us know.
Great job, Connie. Thank you. Any quick questions for Connie before we move on? Okay, Dan, you want to talk about the preschool promise master agreement?
Good afternoon. Glad to answer any questions about the master agreement. Our preschool promise master agreement came out of the 2017 school levy, which was a $48 million levy, $15 million of which we committed to early childhood programming, both within Cincinnati Public Schools and with private preschool providers. The private preschool provider portion has been managed by Cincinnati Preschool Promise, which is a sort of wholly owned subsidiary of the United Way. Our agreement ended contemporaneously with when the levy funds ended, and that will be this summer, 2022. And so the levy has already been renewed. It was renewed last school year. And so with this new 5-year levy, we are discussing renewal of this agreement as well. Glad to answer any questions. Or we have a draft, sort of draft changes from Preschool Promise that they've proposed. Jen Wagner and I and Vera Brooks, who manages early childhood education within CPS, have reviewed those changes. We have some recommendations as well, and probably will want to share those with the board, as that'll be our first step. We have not yet kind of shared those changes. I'm not even sure all the board members have seen the Preschool Promise draft at this point.
Have we been spending all the money properly?
The agreement assures that we are spending the money properly, correct?
Okay.
Yep.
Any questions for Dan?
Yeah, thank you. And this might be more for the school board members. Is this program having a positive impact, and how do we know?
I would say that it is. Char Fisher Jackson comes and reports to the Finance Committee, who's oversees the Preschool Promise. And we're seeing more kids get enrolled in preschool. We're seeing kindergarten readiness go up. So all this sort of metrics that you would use to, decide whether or not the preschool system is even working. We're seeing those boxes get checked. And then at the district, we've proliferated our seats. We have a ton of preschool seats now. We're starting to look where they're like preschool deserts, most of which are on the east side of town, it appears. And so notably too, as y'all know, the fund, so there's voucher, last dollar in sort of stuff for kids, that are getting maybe Head Start and then get some Preschool Promise on top. But it's also to bring centers up to quality. And we're also seeing in this city, I'm talking to my colleagues in Cleveland and Columbus, I can tell you with certainty, the amount of 5-star centers we have is astonishing. And so that piece of it too, I would call out as being highly effective. And then last, I'm not just going to be all roses and flowers and stuff. So I think the last piece though, the code to crack, this is one board member's opinion, is like the sort of workforce piece, and working with the workforce at the providers. We know that we can pay, and we're lucky. We have levies that get renewed by the taxpayers over and over again, and we're grateful for that. We can pay our educators pretty well. The same isn't always the case out in the world. And so there's been efforts over the past 5 years or whatever, I think, looking at that. I don't know that code's been cracked, but we're working hard.
Okay. Are you statistically following kids that start with preschool promise and seeing that their grades are, being consistent as they move on through their academic career?
It's like 2/3 of the kids. So there's the kids that are ours. So like our son, for example, will go to Hayes Porter next year, the West End, and then he'll go to kindergarten. He's easy to track. He's in our system. Then there's kids that go from a community provider to us, a little trickier, but still can kind of, and then there's the kids that are community provider and go to a charter school or the archdiocese, and we can't say with confidence there.
Any more questions for Dan?
The only other thing I'll add that I think might be interesting to the audit committee is was really innovative because, the idea, this is school levy funds, and the idea that we were going to spend these dollars on private provider preschool not even being required, in a public school district, much less to spend money for private providers. I think the audit committee may find it interesting because at the time, Treasurer Wagner and I went through a lot of, we had a lot of legal review, but we also met directly with the Ohio auditors team to say, this is ensuring that this is a proper public purpose for the way we spend school district dollars. And it was, but at the time we were the only ones in the state doing it. I believe still we are the only ones that have. There are other preschool promise efforts throughout the state, but not aware of any that specifically use school district dollars. So very innovative program.
Question, does the 5-star rating include assurance of proper spending of the money that the private schools receive?
The 5-star rating is it's actually an ODJFS, I think, designation, and Ohio Department of Education. And it's a state designation of the quality of the program being offered. All of CPS's preschool programs are rated 5-star, and many of the private providers are also rated 5-star. The idea is to bring those that aren't up to a high star quality rating.
My question wasn't about the quality. My question was, does the 5-star quality assure that the money is spent properly? You asked that this was important to the audit committee.
I believe it's more related to the quality of the educators, so that whether or not they have certificated staff or not, what kind of.
So is that an internal audit scope that maybe we look at?
I'm afraid that the agreement includes the CPS review at that level, but I think the thing that we can rely on to a good degree is that CPP has a financial statement audit that I believe is required from the agreement. So I'll certainly refer to Treasurer Wagner to add more.
So the payments, we collect the money, and the payments go directly to United Way, and they disperse the money to CPP, who then pays the vendors. They'll pay the individual centers for tuition, but in their quality improvement efforts, in other words, the efforts to try to coach up a center to get to a higher stage of quality is paid directly to their vendors. They're not paid to the school to allocate out. And so in addition to that, I sit on their finance committee, and we meet monthly and we review their finances. They contact me they used to, not so much anymore, about proper public purpose, because they try to get creative with some of their things. And so they are audited financially, and I am confident that they're doing a good job.
Yep.
If I could, I would just add 2 or 3 things. One, particularly that the Preschool Promise Board of Managers is an independent body from us. So there's 2 independent boards. I would also remind people that may have forgotten, nobody else except Cincinnati Public Schools was willing to be the taxing agent for this project. A lot of the people, whether they're the city people or the county people, all refused to be the taxing agent. So to quote former Superintendent Mary Ronan, the last superintendent we had that had an MBA in business, this is our money. It belongs to the taxpayers. We collect it and we oversee it. And indeed, it has worked out fairly well with all the altruism and all of the pragmatism about this, all the innovation. This district became the taxing agent for this. And it really raised the tax bills in that we were really looking at some tax revolt because people didn't attribute it to preschool promise, which they love. So it was a big risk, and I think we were right to take it, and it's been a fabulous thing to do. And it'll be great to get the new master agreement. And I know one of the things that's always emphasized is to get rid of saying it has to be also about quality. And that's an issue that usually is a point of confrontation for us, and we'll work through that as well. Because that was the promise made to the taxpayers and the voters, is that we were not only expanding preschool and not only trying to get rid of the deserts that indeed existed and to allow more and more children to be able and their families to be able to get their kids there, but it was also that we were improving quality. It was not just to fund a lack of quality, but that differentiation between what the public sector pay is versus maybe what the private vendors pay is remains a hard nut to crack.
Just one quick question. So there are private providers and we provide preschool also. So is it about 50-50 between what CPS provides and what private providers provide?
So I can answer that. So the number of their students that qualify for tuition assistance, because it's based on an income scale and the rating of the center, and the number of students that we educate that also qualify as last dollar in, is about the same. It's close.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
And,
you.
Jennifer, you want to update us on the upcoming levies?
Yes, I just have one little slide, so if you don't mind, I'm going to sit here instead of walking over there. So Rob, can you bring my little one slide up? You have a copy of this slide in the Finance Committee PowerPoint that's in your folder. No, not that slide. Well, that's okay. Just go ahead. There you go. So the levy that's coming up for renewal this November is a $51.5 million levy. It was first enacted in 2008 as new money. And this will be its third renewal. And so we've presented, I think I've presented 2 or 3 times to Finance Committee and shared all the different options for renewal with the Finance Committee. And they were proposing to the full board to extend it to a 10-year, similar to what we did with the $65 million levy. You can see down under the election history, I'm providing you issue 12. We passed it for the 4th time in 2019 with a 10-year cycle, and it passed at a 71.8% approval rating, which I think is probably the highest that we've had in history in terms of approvals, but it's certainly higher than issue 17, which is the levy we were just talking about that included the preschool levy, which we renewed in 2020 for another 5-year because this is the first renewal, and that passed at almost a 70% rating. So in order for us to move forward, the board has to pass 2 resolutions. The first one has to be 100 days before Election Day, so we have some time to deal with this, but it's a resolution that indicates the need to have the levy. And then the second resolution certifies the ballot language once the county auditor calculates the millage.
Have we ever tried to float a continuing levy?
I keep trying.
We never tried, right?
Yes, we
We've
did.
done it once and it failed.
And it failed. Let's just say it. It failed. One time in 15 years that I've been on the board, that's the only levy that failed. But also that year, with the continuing, we also did not have a unanimous 7 vote from the board. It was a 6-1, which is deadly. And so the Finance Committee and the Treasurer warmly endorse the 10-year instead of the 5-year. We brought it at least 3 or 4 times to the full board, but there were still board members that wanted to have a full board discussion. And we hope that that's not going to be delayed much longer than maybe the very next meeting, although we did not want to have our new superintendent be the first thing she arrives and asks for money. But it does look like, now I hope it is the first thing she asked for on May 9th, because the longer it's waiting out there, there's just too many negative vibes throughout everybody's community right now. So we're really proud of what we're recommending, and I think that will pass.
Great. Okay. Any other questions for Jennifer about the levies, proposed levy? Okay. Eve, do you want to give us other business or district updates?
Well, you have before you the 100-day plan of our new superintendent. You know that she has been very, very busy with the budget. We basically put a bit of a pause on some of the earliest administrative work that's been going on. Our treasurer has worked extremely closely with her about the budget. She's also been interviewing her senior staff. She's met with members of the community, and she has a very, very hectic schedule for the first 60 or 90 days. It looks like we're all going to be in a board retreat in the middle part of May with our new superintendent as well. We're very excited to have her. We gave a great send-off and are happy to say our previous superintendent is going to be the director of Cincy Works. CEO, all these technologies. I'll be technical. CEO. And we're excited that she's staying in Cincinnati, and we're excited that we're going to get a new leader as well. I think Ms. Amat had only one misfortune, and that was going to be that she would be the fourth internal candidate and to be superintendent. And that is, if you think sometimes you need new thoughts, new flesh and blood and energy. So we're excited, and I'm sure she'll do very well, and I'm sure we'll cause her all kinds of trouble right from the get-go. So I'm sure. I'm sure we will. Hey, we will. I will tell you. But this board is excited about the future.
Anybody have any questions for Eve or the board members that are present? I'd like to wrap up by asking our internal auditors to stand up. You guys are doing a fantastic job. I read through your reports. They're really good. Thank you so much for all that you do for us. There being no further business, this meeting is adjourned.